Language production and learning.
Okay, great. So I'd like to talk about this important question in linguistic theory, I think, namely that how we actually map a particular meaning on a particular form as we produce language. And specifically, continuing on the topic of ZIP and the principle of least effort, I'd like to talk about this problem from the point of view of efficiency. So in both linguistically and also in many different domains, we see this pattern again and again, namely that unmarked or simpler meanings are encoded with simpler forms. And likewise, more frequent and predictable words or meanings are likely to be reduced or produced with reduced forms or simply omitted, right? So even when you look at the same word produced by the same person, when it's less predictable, the duration can be longer. When it's more predictable, mama, you know, you know what the next word is, and then it's reduced, right? So it's been accepted. This type of finding has been replicated over and over, but we haven't really talked about one big question, namely, what are we talking about? Predictability of a particular form or predictability of a particular meaning? So that's the question that I want to address in this talk today. And I'd like to do so by looking at a particular domain of nominal morphology, the number marking morphology, and especially singular plural marking. And as you probably know, this is a domain where a lot of interesting linguistic theory has been put forward to account for how these different meanings are mapped onto different forms. So in many languages, like in English, a base form has a singulative meaning, and then if you want to turn it into a plural form, you want to add additional morpheme. In a way, it's intuitive, simpler meaning, simpler form, the more complex or additional meaning, additional form, right? But in some other languages, there are some other systems, named, for example, in Welsh, basic form has this plural meaning, peas. And if you want to specifically talk about one pea, you need to add a particular morpheme to say that it was singular, right? So it's possible. It's kind of like, looks like an opposite pattern from English. And what's more interesting is that an interesting example comes from this language called Nagare. In this language, just like English, for some classes of nouns, when you add a marker, re, then it turns a singular into plural. Be child, be re, children. But you can use the same marker and attach it to a particular class of nouns, then you can turn a plurative to a singulative. So be seeds, and when you specifically want to talk about particular seed, you say be re. Right? Clearly, there are many different patterns in terms of how you can map these different meanings onto different forms, and arguably, for us at least, you know, some patterns seem to be a little peculiar than others, but I think there is this useful generalization to be made, namely that these systems might come about when languages characterize linguistic signals on the meaning that is otherwise less predictable or less likely to be inferred by listeners. So let me elaborate on that. So for reference, like peas and seeds and little insects like ants, plural meaning is sort of more predictable in the sense that when you see one, there's likely to be more, right? And you don't usually talk about just one instance of pea, so the plural meaning is more predictable based on your world knowledge. But for reference like a child, or maybe like a rainbow, the plural meaning is, in some sense, less predictable. When you see two rainbows at the same time, you want to mention it. It's noteworthy, and the meaning is otherwise less predictable. So, in some sense, if the language users are making an efficient use of the language system, encoding system, it kind of makes sense to put an word marker for an otherwise less predictable meaning, or word singulative marking for these reference, but word plural markings for these reference. So this is a prediction made by some other people and also our group. So this is a hypothesis, and in this study, we want to test this hypothesis in language production behavior. So our idea is that this type of bias or pressure might be at work at the grammatical system level, and also in our spontaneous language production behaviors as well. So in order to do so, we created this optional, we used an miniature artificial language learning paradigm. We created a language where plural marking is optional. You might do it, you might not do it, so you need to choose either which form to use, right? So our prediction is that if this hypothesis is true, or language users of this language might be more likely or less likely to use overt plural marking for a particular class of nouns, but they might be more likely to use overt plural marking for another class of nouns. Does that make sense? That's the prediction. But before moving on to that particular study, I want to sort of talk about one thing, a rationale behind using the artificial language learning paradigm to ask this specific question. So the question has to do with the big question that I mentioned earlier. Which predictability are we talking about? Is it form predictability or meaning predictability? And in order to answer this question, you need to answer the sub-question, namely, how do we actually estimate the meaning predictability, right? So it's a tricky question, and we might need to think about how we do that, right? And one approach that has been taken is something like this. So Haskelman and his colleagues collected a bunch of nouns in different languages. I'm just showing an example from English, and counted token frequencies of plural forms versus singular forms. So like odds ratio of plural versus singular, but basically it means how likely it is that you use the plural form over the singular form. So what this graph is showing is that when you say American, lemma American, then you're more likely to say Americans versus American, right? The shoes over shoe, blah, blah, blah. And apparently apples, apple are equally likely because it's kind of zero. And the odds ratio is flipped for some, or it's like boys and girls, right? So apparently, according to the data, you're more likely to say a boy or the boy over boys. Yeah, so that's what it shows. And some other researchers kind of use this type of plural predictability to predict what people are doing, speakers are doing in language production. And Rose et al. Took different production instances of production and measured the phonetic duration of S in plural form. And they found that the duration of S is actually longer for words that are less likely to be plural. So in this case, the girls, this one is longer than the S attached to shoe, which is more likely to be plural. So it makes sense, it's convincing, and it's promising. But here we are still left with this question, the same question, right? I'll be talking about the predictability of the S form, right? Given a word, S is so predictable that you don't have to say it clearly, or the meaning of plural. It's predictable for a particular word over others, so you don't have to give too much linguistic encoding, linguistic signal to the meaning. So these are really subtle differences, and also it's really hard to tease them apart when you're looking at an existing language because they're highly correlated with each other, usually. So in order to tease them apart, we wanted to create a system where we can actually explicitly control the meaning predictability independent of the form predictability. So that's what we are trying to do in this study. So the first question is, if we create such a system, is the predictability of plural meaning a significant predictor of optional plural marker use? So we created two classes of nouns, and we created a bunch of novel items, and we sort of like differentiated two classes of nouns, and I'm going to show you how we did that. Okay, so an overview of our experiment. In experiment 1, 40 people, native speakers of American English, participated in the study. They learned 12 novel nouns and only one novel verb. So it's like a miniature artificial language. And this language had this optional plural marker, ka. It was sometimes used for plural meaning, the plural meaning, sometimes it wasn't used. And they went through different learning phases. And at the end, they produced sentences in this novel language. And that's our data. So we are interested in how likely it is that learners actually use this marker in their production. So I'm going to show you some examples. So at the beginning, you're presented with different characters, one at a time. So let's do this together. This one.
Nord. Kukta.
And then you do this again and again for 24 trials, right? And then the next phase is just like the previous talk, it's an OAFC task. So you see 4 different candidates, and then you hear a word,
Kukta.
and then you need to choose one, and then each time you get feedback. You click on one, and then you get feedback. It was actually this one. Next one.
Pisa.
And you don't know which one is Pesa, but actually this one, right? And you go through this again and again for your trials. And then the next phase is sentence comprehension. So you see a video, and then there was narration attached to it, and you listen to it, you watch it, listen to it, and then repeat it.
Nord. Ka. Glim. Melnog. Glim.
Right? And you do this again. And then finally, you see a video, and you need to produce a sentence. It looks hard, it's actually hard. I struggle in this experiment. But people did it. People learned it really well. Thank you. Okay. So what's interesting in this experiment is that by going through these phases, you're supposed to be learning 2 things. One is obviously a set of words, right? That's an explicit task for you participants, and they have to learn words and they have to produce words. But implicitly, they were actually learning something else also, which is plural predictability. How likely you are to see a singleton versus multiples of a particular reference. Right? You're not instructed to pay attention to them, but implicitly you sort of like accumulate the statistics. So let me explain how it went. So when you see an animal, you have 6 animals and 6 insects. Whenever you see an animal, it's a singleton 75% of the time. You're more likely to see one instance of any particular animal, right? But when you see an insect, it was a singleton 25% of the time, right? But and then, well, clearly, the proportion was flipped for the multiple reference. So when you see an animal, it's multiple 25% of the time, and you're more likely to see a number of insects, right, compared to a singleton insect. So, and it was actually constant even for destructors in the 4 AFC trials. You see them on the background, and they had these statistics. So you learn this by going through these training phases. And one more thing that's important is that when you see multiples, it was produced with cut only 2/3 of the time. It was the same for the animals and in the insects. So it's always 66%. In this sense, the form predictability was constant across these 2 clusters of nouns. So based on this, we predicted in their production, they would be, if they're using this marker to encode the meaning efficiently, they're less likely to use cut for animals or insects. Insects were presented as multiples. That was the prediction. Okay, so let me show you the data. Okay, this is what we found. So, this is a case where you see animal when in the production phase. Singleton, you see only one animal, you need to produce a sentence to describe the scene. Multiples, the same thing. And then the y-axis is the proportion of ka use, how likely it is that you use ka in your sentence. And when you see only one of them, you never use it, right? And when you see multiple of them, even though the input frequency probability was 66, you're more likely to use it. You're far more likely to use it, just like in English. So it's probably the case that people are. So these are native speakers for their English, so they use their sort of knowledge about the English plural, and they sort of transfer that knowledge. So it's almost like categorical. Okay. So what's interesting is that our prediction is that, well, this bar should be lower for insects, right? And then that's what we found. Unfortunately, we don't have a cat, so it's just exciting, but it was significant. So in the sense that, well, even though the form predictability in the input was exactly the same for animals and insects, when they're asked to produce sentences, they're less likely to use cut for a particular class of nouns, where the meaning of plural is more predictable. So that's what we found. And what's an additional thing that's kind of interesting is that numerically speaking, in the input again, you hear cut more often with the insects, right? By virtue of the fact that they appear as multiples more often, but when they're asked to produce, they're less likely to use ka for insects. So, which is interesting and it's supporting our sort of general idea. And we started thinking, okay, where does this plural meaning predictability actually come from? And in the first experiment, there were at least two different sources. One is that, well, it might be just their world knowledge. As I said, you know that some things appear as multiples more often. And our characters look like real world insects, so maybe it's a transfer of knowledge. And then also the other source is the exposure input. We explicitly manipulated how often you see singletons versus multiples. Right? So if the effect that we saw in experiment 1 is only due to the world knowledge, we cannot conclude that we manipulated the meaning predictability through the input. So we wanted to do another study where people are less likely to carry over the knowledge that they have based on English. So that's the goal of experiment 2. And so we basically replicated exactly the same thing, except that we used a new set of visual items. So now we don't have insects and animals, we have nouns, objects. So there are still smaller ones, and there are smaller ones and the bigger ones. And the smaller ones are bluish, and the big ones are reddish. So in some sense, you have some visual cues in terms of which classes a particular instance should fall into. But basically, you haven't seen them before, so you don't have any world knowledge expectation as to how likely they should occur as singletons versus multiples. And the design of the study is exactly the same. And the bluish items have the statistics of the insects in experiment 1. The reddish, larger shapes have the statistics of the animals in experiment 1. So we did the same thing, so the results are plotted in the same way. When you see a larger reddish object, and when they appear as singletons, you never use ka. Right? When you see multiple of them, you are far more likely to use ka, just like, again, English S. Okay, so again, the prediction is that it should go down, and that's what we found. So this cannot be explained by saying that, well, maybe characters look more like insects, so that's the source of the information. We put together all the data sets and compared the effect, and there was no significant difference between experiment 1 and experiment 2, which suggests that people can actually learn the predictability of plural meaning within this experiment through the exposure, and they can kind of condition the language production on the knowledge or the statistical knowledge that they acquired, again, within this experiment. So this brings us to the conclusion. We saw that there seems to be this strong bias towards explicitly encoding a meaning that is otherwise less predictable. And this seems to be at work and manifests itself in this process of language learning. And then I think it has a lot of implication into language variation and change. Right? And a big question that I hope to have highlighted in this talk is this: can we actually count meaning? Can we somehow estimate the probability or predictability of meaning independent of frequencies and predictability of forms that are used to convey these meanings? Right? So when you make a theory where we say one is guiding the other, one is conditioned on the other, we want to have a way to independently assess what they are. Otherwise, it gets circular easily, right? So we want to have some measure of meaning predictability, meaning frequency, but we don't know whether it's possible, whether it's meaningful. So that's the question. And I think this is going to be an important key question to all of us, those of us who are interested in how we can actually understand and study form meaning mapping in a quantitative manner. And then I think it's going to be an interesting question. So I'd like to have your feedback and questions. Thank you.